Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you are in this world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. We have looks to be a lot of fun, today's webinar, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will be able to access it on demand later on. After the webinar, we'll be sending out an email that contains a link that you can access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question, don't wait, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your question, and we'll take a few minutes before the end of the webinar and go through those questions. Okay, with that, I would like to get started on today's webinar, which is continuous deployments, the holy grail of your continuous delivery pipeline. That is a bold statement. We've got Tracy Reagan, CEO of DeployHub, as our speaker today. Hi, Tracy, how are you?
Hi, I'm good, thank you.
Okay, well, I'm gonna go ahead and put myself on mute and let you jump right in.
Okay, so thank you, Charlene, and thank you, DevOps.com, for hosting this webinar. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak out to the DevOps.com audience. I'm Tracy Reagan. I am the CEO of now what is called DeployHub. I have been in the build and deploy business for quite some time, starting back in the 1980s on Wall Street, where I worked in this area on, yes, the mainframe. I hate to say it, but I did. And have grown and learned quite a bit about what the struggles are and kind of understand where we're going. And we're going to talk a little bit about where we've been, where we're going, and we're also going to talk about how continuous deployments are going to relate to microservices, because I think that's what we really should be talking about at this point. I have sat on some open source communities, was on the Eclipse Foundation board for about 5 years, and now I run a company called DeployHub that is an open source offering around continuous deployment. So if we start from the top here, if we think about what we've gone through over the last, I'd say 4 or 5 years, is a real transformation in terms of how we are being asked to develop software. Slow is not working anymore, but we don't necessarily have all the tools in place to go fast, but the transformation is coming anyway, even if we don't like it. It's coming, and there's more transformation coming with the modern architecture. What we are doing now will need to even be further adjusted for the microservice platform. So if we think about where we've been, we've come from the waterfall culture, and I call this slide, but I'm not dead yet. I feel happy because waterfall is still out there. So waterfall, of course, is a practice that is risk averse, and it's slow and methodical, but that's not necessarily what we want to be doing. In the waterfall world, high frequency is equal to failure. If you have code going out on a high frequency basis, it must be broken. And we still have residue from the Sarbanes-Oxley and the separation of duties. And so what we see is a water scrum fall approach, where you have a continuous delivery pipeline, but it may not be doing deployments all the way to production. And for the most part, it probably isn't as iterative as it needs to be. And we really are trying to do something that's more agile. So after waterfall, we really started saying we're going to do agile development, but we didn't necessarily go all the way. We got training, and as this Dilbert cartoon kind of implicates, that we were trained because we learned the word agile, and we needed to go off and do what agile was requiring us to do, which is do smaller and more frequent updates and push that out to production as quickly as possible, because in the end of the day, what our users want is innovation in their hands as quick as possible. And as we all know, Facebook went down for 20 minutes, I think it was on Monday, and the world almost, fell apart. People were really angry about it. And that's not even really a critical application. We all know we can do without our Facebook for 20 minutes. But we are, as a customer base, we have an amazing appetite for digital products. And that is why we went, we turned in towards sort of what I call the hero phase of the agile culture, whereby the basic agile principles are being implemented designing and coding in an iterative fashion, and understanding that if we're releasing on an infrequent basis, that is equal to failure. So in Agile, you want to release on a regular basis, on a continuous basis, but to be quite honest, we're not really set up for it. Testing and operation tasks have to be shifted over to the development teams. We are starting to hear more and more, I'm sure many of you might be in the role of a site reliability engineer, whereby more of the operational tasks are going to be pushed over to the development teams. So this means we have cultural changes as well as process changes and changes that we need in automation that adds more transparency. And what we're really talking about is more of a process that is around lifecycle management, and we call that continuous delivery pipeline. So oftentimes when we go out and we talk to people who are struggling with this topic, continuous deployment, they often tell us, we already have a continuous deployment process. It's quite nice, they tell us. And when we talk to them about what their problems are in the end run, their real problem is getting this stuff out to production. And while it may be true that the developers have a holy grail that allows them to move a jar file from point A to point B under a product like a Jenkins or a Bamboo, or even now a GitHub Action, that's not everything that needs to be managed when it comes to a production deployment, particularly if the goal is to be able to do them in a more live fashion, where you can just implement pieces and parts and not have to bring down all of production in order to do that. So yes, people do deployments in the continuous delivery model, but would I call it continuous? I don't think I would. There's work to be done before we get there. And that work is about bridging Agile with these nonstop deployments. So it's really a balancing act, because what developers need to be able to do is do a continuous deployment pipeline to end users, and that means all the way to production. So it's a push methodology that delivers across the life cycle. At the point in time that release candidate is ready to go, it's allowed to go. Even the idea of a manual approval process blocks that from happening. So in the dev world, we are willing to sacrifice control and transparency for speed, but that doesn't mean operations is willing to do that. Because operations, they want planned releases. They want to be able to pull a release after it's been approved, and they will sacrifice speed for audit. So we have a balancing act to achieve between these two groups in order to be able to do the level of continuous deployment that Agile demands today and microservices will demand tomorrow. So we have to begin automating the manual steps underneath the covers and the manual scripts to reduce the risk around and increase the control as well as speed around doing continuous deployments in order for operations to be able to embrace it. And that's really, really what, when it gets down to the wire, developers are ready to go. And if they had tooling and more transparency, operations would be ready to go. That is what this whole tool set, it's often called application release automation tools. Deploy Hub is a player in that space. CA has products. The Atomic line is their product line. You have Zabia Labs is out there, and IBM is out there, and there's a few others like Electric Cloud. The goal of these types of tools, these ARA tools, is to allow a fast and transparent way to get new innovation out to end users as quickly as possible. So that's continuous deployment, and what I call that the holy grail of your continuous delivery pipeline. So let's just talk a little bit about what those tools should be doing, in my opinion, and I've worked in this space for quite some time. We're working on our Deploy Hub, the open source product, to be able to deliver these types of features. So first of all, it needs to be able to manage a full application stack. Your application binaries, your jar file, for example, as well as a database, as well as environment variables and infrastructure, because all of that together makes up your application. It's not just one binary or a big fat DLL that you're sending out to somebody. It is a host of pieces and parts that have to work together. When you pull together your deployment, what you're doing is you're creating a deployment configuration. Now, we've talked a lot about configuration as code for quite some time, and you need to be able to version that configuration. You need to be able to version it so you can clearly do rollbacks and roll forwards and what I call version jumping. Let's say development is at version 10 and production has gotten behind and they're at version 3. You want to be able to do a jump to from 3 to 10, which means that the database has to be able to be incrementally applied. And sometimes it could even be environment variables that you have to catch up between different releases. And you may even have an infrastructure update, a new version of a Tomcat, something as simple as that. And the other thing is we got to stop doing scripts. The scripts are not transparent and they're really manual. So if you think about where scripts were born, scripts were born in Waterfall. Scripts were around when we had the luxury of time to tweak them. And we could set a date in the future. And we're going to do I can remember the days would say we're going to do a build next Friday. Make sure you have all your stuff checked in before next Friday. And then the poor soul that had to sit and work on the build, sometimes was me. You'd have to figure out why the build wasn't working, go back and talk to everybody, figure out why things weren't working. And then you had to do it all over again in the deployment scripts. But you had them. Putting those scripts underneath a Jenkins orchestration type tool, a CI server, doesn't fix the problem. It just speeds up the amount of times you can run the scripts, which means that they just break more often. So that's why you're always fixing your scripts. So when it comes to deployments, especially if you're pushing them all the way out to production on this high frequency basis, the scripts are just not going to cut it because the process has to be fast but safe. If you start breaking things because your scripts aren't updated, you missed one little tweak, production's going to push back and say, we can't do this. The other thing is agentless. The tools that are out in the market now, Harness.io is agentless, Deploy Hub is agentless, and Zabbia is agentless. And the reason why that's important is because when you go to implement these tools, if you're coming from the developer side of the house, the last thing you want to do is tell your operations department that you have yet another agent to be put out on their production machines. It slows down the implementation of your of your continuous deployment process. Also, you don't want to have agents on microservices. And we are going to be moving to microservices much faster than anybody ever imagined. I think the purchase of Red Hat from IBM for $35 billion, I wanted to about faint when I heard that number. I think we know now that who's won the game, and Kubernetes is here and microservices are here. So having an agent on every single microservice is not going to really work. And I've heard people complain on the production side that they don't want a Jenkins agent on every single production machine if you're trying to do this with a Jenkins server. So agentless delivery is important. So basically what I'm saying is the continuous deployment tooling has to be part of your continuous delivery process, but it's a tool that's being called underneath the covers in the same way as you would do continuous test. You don't just rely on scripts to do continuous test. I'm sure most of you are using something like JFrog, Selenium, or some automation tool of that way. That's what you have to do with your deployments. You have to move away from doing it manually or in some really low functioning scripted way, and you have to elevate that step. And that elevation of that step needs to provide a lot of visibility for the production team, and it has to provide the development team the pieces and parts that they need to be able to put it together as a whole application stack, not just a single jar file or WAR file. So I keep talking about scripts, and they're just much too perilous. They're like the castle anthrax. They look really nice, and it's nice and warm in there, but maybe you shouldn't be there. You know, it looks easy and low cost, but in the end, it keeps you locked into some old waterfall ways of doing things, and they really cannot achieve continuous deployments for most companies. Now, I'm not saying that if you had a team of people who are SREs, they couldn't write some really awesome scripts to keep continuous deployments going, but not everybody has that kind of budget. And what's happening is that there's a sustainability issue in trying to do continuous deployments because people on the production side are not being increased in terms of headcount. So in the Waterfall days, we had maybe 3 or 4 production release people on the production side managing developers' productions releases, and they were doing maybe, I don't know, 5 a year, 6 a year at very most. Now change that to 6 a day. The operations side of the house simply does not have that kind of staff. So they themselves have to stop doing scripts, because what we see often is developers have their scripts. Sometimes testing has their own, but more than likely they take the developers, but production does their own thing. And this is just a broken, dysfunctional way of doing things. First of all, they lack the ability to kind of adapt across the life cycle automatically. So let's say you have an environment variable that needed to change across them. You shouldn't have to modify a script for that. A database name. There are pretty simple things that you could name that should not be hard coded in a script. You need more transparency, and we hear this discussion about value stream tracking. This concept of value stream came from a kind of a more of a manufacturing production model where they have assembly lines where you say, okay, we know we want to make a change to this particular product, and how long did it take us to get it all the way out to the end user? When you have a scripted process underneath your continuous delivery model, you don't get that value stream feedback loop. So the critical intelligence in the logs and whatnot is hard to share and hard to report back and put into the reporting. And it kind of keeps you in a monolithic model. And that is probably the biggest problem, because most of your build scripts and your deploy scripts are built around a monolithic model. Everything that needs to go out for that application is put in it. It's not decomposed. So one of the ways to get out of that is the scripted model is to move from more of a model-driven versus a script-driven method. So model-driven methods are repeatable across the life cycle. They adapt across the life cycle. Development deployments are exactly the same as test, and tests are exactly the same as prod, except for where they're different. And those are handled in an automatic way in these ARA tools, or what I would prefer to call continuous deployment solutions. So that's one of the ways that you can stop doing those scripted deployments. You start using reusable pieces that have those hard-coded pieces extrapolated out of it, and it's sitting at a higher level, so you can see what those changes are between those environments, and they're automatically applied. So I talked a little bit about Agentless, and we're going to kind of move into this concept of microservices and why continuous deployment is probably going to be more of a discussion around this than it is now. So microservices is just not, cloud with a VM image that looks like a physical server. Kubernetes is really a new data center altogether. It's completely different from the way we think about building out a physical server or a virtual server. You know, the way I see it is Docker is the new server and Kubernetes is the new data center, and microservices is a much leaner approach. Because we tried to do this once before. We tried to do this through object-oriented programming, is to create these highly reusable pieces. And I'm not talking about just the highly reusable pieces in terms of a model-driven deployment. I'm talking about highly reusable pieces within your application. When we tried to do that before in object-oriented programming, we stuck with our old build scripts, and people started not using reusable code, but they copied code. In the microservices world, we can't make that mistake. We need to be able to reuse the microservice, and we need to know where that microservice is, and we need to be able to track the version of them so we can understand the collection of microservices that make up our monolithic equivalent. I often tell people when they ask me about this is that this shift is bigger than moving from the mainframe to distributed servers. It is a bigger shift than that. because developers are going to have to rethink how they put together their applications, and they're going to have to think in terms of how reuse is important. And the layer of object-oriented linking comes from your service mesh. So let's start from the very beginning. And if we think about microservices, what's going to be important in understanding what your application looks like, which is a collection of your microservices. And if we think about it today without microservices, let's think about it in terms of what your complete application stack look like and what are the components within it. So I think the easiest way to think about it is in terms of deployment packaging. And most of the tools on the market have deployment packaging, some don't. But most of them have some level of packaging your pieces that make up your application. So a package is generally a collection of components, and these terms are becoming fairly standard within the continuous deployment industry. Components can be your application artifacts, a database update. It could be a Puppet script that updates an infrastructure component, or it could be test cases or even environment variables. And if you think about what a component will be in the future, it will be a microservice. So now you have an application that's all built together, but if you look down and you decomposed it, you would decompose it into individual components, and those components map directly to a microservice. So if we think about what happens then is you have your application base version, and over time you have your versions. So understanding this configuration as code is critical, which means that versioning is extremely important. Now that's what we do differently with Deploy Hub. Everything that is defined to your application package has an associated component and a component item, and all of that business is versioned in a backend versioning tool so that you can do the roll forwards, roll back, and version jumping, or simply release one microservice or one feature out to an end user. So if you really want to deploy software like Facebook and Netflix and Amazon, probably should change this now that Facebook had an outage, poor things. You really have to move from this monolithic style of thinking of things into these independent functions. Now, Agile has told us to do that a long time ago. Agile said, just make one change, get one change out to the end user, then start another change, and have that coming out like a software assembly line. But because we held on to our big build scripts, and because we hold on to our big deployment scripts, we struggle with doing that without re-releasing and recompiling everything as a monolithic. You won't be able to do that with your microservices. You're going to think about those pieces moving out in an independent way. So think about what your application would look like if it was decomposed into its reusable parts. Now, when you're just doing Agile and you haven't made the jump to microservice, you can still do this. And this is a good way to get yourself thinking in terms of the individual parts of your application. So your continuous deployment tool or ARA tools, whatever you want to call them, they help you with decomposing your parts so that you understand what is being released. It's not just put in a script that starts at the top and ends at the bottom. You have a service mesh that does all the request routing for you. So the service mesh is like it does all the linking. So in the object-oriented programming world, we try to do that with dynamic link libraries, but because we often we were copying these objects, that caused us issues. And in the microservice world, your applications will be linked at runtime. So the service mesh will decide who gets what, and it will track who's using what, which is kind of an important piece of the puzzle. So in the Kubernetes world, you have products like Linkerd and Istio, who's going to be part of your runtime decision making when it comes to what service is using, who's using what service. So I like to think this in terms of a magic bicycle. So let's just pretend that we ordered a bike from Amazon, and we loved it, and our girlfriend decided she wanted a bike just like it, but she wanted a different color seat. Now, wouldn't it be cool if you could have Amazon push a button for you and that bike would replicate itself and they just sent you a red seat? It would change the way we do business pretty drastically. The box would be smaller. You wouldn't have to reassemble the bike. And you already know that the bike is working perfectly, and all you need to do is switch out the seat. It cuts down the risk, it cuts down the cost. And that's kind of what microservice is doing, because instead of having a full bike sent to you, you have a frame assembly, you have a wheel assembly, you have the chain, you have the seat, and you have the handlebars, and only those pieces are operating independently. Now, the crazy thing about microservices is that what you have, you could potentially have multiple versions of your bicycle running in your Kubernetes environment at the same time, and they're considered production. So you could have some folks running on the seat with a black bicycle and other folks running with a seat on the red bicycle, but the only difference between those two releases is the color of the seat. And it's only a difference between a version of one microservice. Now, if you take it another level, think about the fact that that changes our concept of what development, test, and production are, right? Because development is now not, in the good old days, you'd have developers would have servers underneath their desk, and you go into another room and they'd have testing servers, and sometimes you'd have a piece of tape on it that said what that server was used for testing. Now you have cloud images that developers can spin up, but they use those privately. In the microservice world, that changes. It's really the service mesh that is going to determine who's using that, and the environments are just going to be based on personas. You're either a developer, and that developer could maybe using the exact same frame as production, but they have a different set of handlebars because they're working on changing the handlebars. So dev, test, and prod are just different versions of the microservice. They're not different environments. They may be pointing to a different version of a database, but that different version of a database is going to be out there as well. So it's one big ball, one big happy family. And if you take this down the road, you can think of it as a big hairball. And that visibility into the microservices content will become really important, because you're going to want to know if you're talking to a user who's having a problem, you need to understand what version of your application that they're using, so you understand what microservices they're using. So this versioning problem that we have now, that we don't version configurations and deployments, will need to be fixed. And that's what ARH solutions really should be doing. So again, the integration with Istio or Linkerd is really who manages who gets what. And things like feature flags are going to be really pushed towards that. And you're going to need to be able to really manage and track all of these relationships. So you can see that if you take on continuous deployment now within your continuous delivery pipeline, and you can start succeeding at doing iterative deployments, really broken down, I'm just going to release this one fix out to this group of users, you are going to be in a better position to take on microservices in the future. So what we have to be able to do at this point, it's like we've constructed a new house called Agile, but we want to add on to it, and that's called Kubernetes. What we really have to do is make sure that our Agile house is completely constructed. We've swept up all the nails, we've thrown away everything, we've moved in all of our furniture, and we're happy there. And if we're doing that well, if we're taking Agile concepts all the way to production, where we have one change that we're making and we are able to get that release candidate out to production that same day, then we're going to be in a much better place to be ready to do Kubernetes. So a message from your sponsor here, Deploy Hub we have a team version. It is completely free for teams to use in our hosted SaaS model. It does have an open source project. So what we did is we basically compiled the open source code, and we hosted it in the same Google Cloud compute environment that we have our what we call Deploy Hub Pro. For most teams, you can get started and go quite far with the team version. The Pro version offers support, additional features around securing production and test environments, if that's what your operation teams want you to do. And it does things like a release train where you can have more than one application being pushed out. But for doing full-on continuous deployments, managed through the process through your continuous delivery pipeline, the open source is completely functional. You would not need to do anything except use that. And if you need the enterprise features, it's $208 per month. It's $2,500 per year. You can go and sign up for it at deployhub.com. And you'll get what's called a project created for you. And under that, you can build your pipeline and map your pipeline right back to your Jenkins environment, build your application and your components, and start deploying and have the visibility needed for production to be happy. We are technology partners with GitHub, CloudBees, Red Hat, now IBM. We're part of the Red Hat Container Program. We are part of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. If you want to meet me or come talk about anything that we discussed today, we will be at KubeCon in Seattle I think it's the second week of December. We're going to be directly across from the CNCF booth, so I'd love to meet some of you. And DevOps.com will be around too, so you can come and introduce yourself to the folks at DevOps.com. And I think that is it. I'll just take questions.
All right, great. We've gotten some questions in so far, but there's plenty of time to get a question in. Just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your question. We'll go ahead and get started with the ones we have. First question, what about the security aspect of Agentless?
So the Agentless tools, and all of them are use pretty much SSH and standard protocols. So there really isn't any additional security issues when it comes to using an agentless model. In fact, you actually have more control, because if you have an agent that's live out on a endpoint, it can execute just about any command somebody sends it. And when you restrict that access just to the deployment, you're actually making things safer. The other thing is that when you're in a big environment, you have lots of endpoints and you're using agents tend to be a weak link, because what will happen is if the agent comes down and you're trying to do a deployment across all those servers and you don't find out until later and you think your deployment was clean, and then you find out a couple of the agents on certain machines were down, and so now you have end users still hitting the old version, it adds a level of risk. So in terms of the security around the agents, because they're using these standard protocols that are already secured down to the operating system, there really isn't any additional exposure.
Okay, great. Second question, let's see, do you see DevOps or continuous delivery applicable for organizations that implement COTS products, such as a government organization? And is there any difference or considerations for those organizations that are not doing custom development?
So that's a great question. And it really, the real question you have to ask yourself to answer that question is there a demand from upper management to start pushing new features out to end users as quickly as possible? And how much are you modifying those, I guess you call them those, that platform? How often are new changes going out? I believe that especially for large government agencies, there's a lot of audit around what's being done, and some of it's still on the mainframe. It's very highly distributed, and it can be more complex than what you might see in, a private enterprise. So while you have more challenges to deal with it, I believe that building out a continuous delivery pipeline and really learning to automate the deployment piece, it becomes critical. And that deployment piece has to be able to have APIs that can integrate into the top level, if that makes sense. Since I don't know what exact tools you're using, it's hard to answer that question. But yes, it's applicable, but you have probably a more complex environment than most people do. I've worked with government agencies before, and they can have 9-10 hour deployment workflows.
Wow.
because there's so many people they have to reach out to. There's so many approvals. And oftentimes those people who are doing the approvals don't even know why they're doing them. They don't know anything about it. But there's just a very heavy waterfall approach to it. It's definitely not dead yet. But that doesn't mean that the application lifecycle management process shouldn't be thought about, and it shouldn't be considered, especially as we move past Agile and into Kubernetes. The government agencies and those cost platforms are going to have to catch up.
Okay. Well, a follow-up question to that is, how does an organization move on to using microservices when it traditionally uses those COTS products? Is this realistic in your opinion?
It depends on, so if you think about the pieces, it depends on how the COTS products are architected. Do you have APIs that you can get to them? How much of it are you customizing? And if it's all driven through a database. So I've seen some of those tools that you have to change a form and it's a database change. And I would have to say that makes it a lot more difficult. But yes, that can be done, because the same thing that you're doing now by updating them is running some kind of a update or a update to a database schema or some kind of an update to that form. You can build that underneath your CI/CD pipeline, and you can include that. You can have the deployment tool handle those pieces and components. So for example, we have people who use Salesforce, right? So Salesforce, you have to write an integration into that into Salesforce to update your Salesforce. You're not updating Salesforce itself. You're updating your Salesforce integration or your Salesforce form. That can be handled through CI/CD, and it can be done on a continuous deployment basis. Now, again, that being said, if the government agency doesn't allow you to bring anything down even for 5 minutes in the middle of the day, you're going to have trouble doing it live. But you can get it down to a very short period of time, so you're okay with doing releases on a regular basis. So you do a release a night as opposed to doing it once every 6 months, like some government agencies do.
All right, great. Just a quick reminder, there's time for questions. If you have a question for Tracy, don't worry, don't hesitate. Just go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your question. And let's move on to the next one here. How does a microservice fit into the CI/CD process?
That's another really great question. So this is this we have to go all the way back to the beginning of continuous integration. So I believe what most companies are going to end up doing is every microservice is probably going to have an independent workflow. A Jenkins workflow is probably going to have its own GitHub or Git repository or whatever version control you're using. And it should have its own path to production. However, what you have to be able to do before you get it to production is you have to be able to add to that that pipeline process a way to capture the configuration of what the monolithic equivalent of your application looks like. So our bicycle, we need to be able to see that we have a new version of our bicycle because a new red seat got released. So I think the problem we're going to have to solve as a community is, how do you manage that many workflows, and how do you manage that many repositories? And when you think about products like platforms like GitHub, everything they do is based on a repository, which, like actions and everything, is based on a repository. So that'll fit quite nicely into that that microservice world. We just have to be able to look across the different microservices and say, now this is my application, but it's a logical view of it. It's not pulling it all together in one monolithic tarball and sending it out.
Okay. All right, so the next question here then has to do with the pricing. So it says Deploy Hub is $2,500 per project. What is a project?
So a project is a collection of components, whether that be a database component or an infrastructure component or a microservice or something in a Docker container. It's a collection of components that make up an application. So if you're a bank, you'd have the teller application, and that would be a project. So it's basically a team of, it would support a team of developers writing one software application that gets deployed as a whole.
Okay. All right, great. Let's see. Next question. Does Jenkins go away if you are doing continuous deployments?
So that depends if you're wanting a continuous delivery pipeline, really. So Jenkins is the king of really doing check-ins and compiles, right? It's based being on a continuous integration server. That won't go away. Your CI process still needs to be out there. Now, if you're trying to build out a continuous delivery model, you could use something like Blue Ocean to manage pushing workflows from development through test and through production. However, continuous deployment tools also have a delivery pipeline built into them. So you might be using Jenkins for doing continuous integration in the way you are today, but you may not be using a product like Blue Ocean. That's the same with like GitLab, because really when we say continuous delivery, when I talk to people like, what do you really want out of continuous delivery? What they really want to be able to do is push deployments. So if the continuous delivery tool is not really supporting a tight integration with a deployment option, it might be in the future that that deployment tool is what does the continuous delivery and the deployment. So while I say that if you've already built out a way to push kick off one workflow from dev to test and then test to prod, and you build those workflows to call the actions to perform the heavy lifting of your continuous testing and your continuous deployment. If you're not already doing that, you might look at some of these tools and say, well, I'm going to have Jenkins do my CI processing. And then when Jenkins gets done, I'm going to push it off to another tool to handle that continuous delivery pipeline. Now, the bad thing about that would be you kind of lose a central point of control. So most of these tools are going to integrate with products like Jenkins and Bamboo and GitLab so that we can push things back and you have one place to see everything. But it's possible. It's totally possible. And I think GitHub Actions is kind of pushing it in that direction as well.
Okay, great. Let's see, next question. What would be a good starting point to move into this continuous deployment model? Do you have any recommendations regarding the quote-unquote learning path to follow in order to learn how to move into this kind of development model?
So you can start at many different places. If you've not started doing a CI/CD pipeline, what you probably would want to do is first take a step back and really determine if the culture of your organization is going to be supportive of the ability to push things to production on a high frequency basis. And if they are, you really as a developer, or if you're asking me this question from the production side, what you really have to do is you have to define the requirements of the development side as well as the production side. It was that, that it's a balancing act between both sides of the house. Get those requirements really written down and clear, almost like a contract between dev and ops. If you have tooling that uses agents, is operations willing to put those agents out there on the production endpoints? What kind of reporting does production want to see when it comes to deploying software on a high frequency basis? What does auditing need to make it okay? So really talk and have a discussion about what you want to see in terms of what developers need to do to make it happen. And we're talking at a very high level first. What does developers need to do to make it happen, and what production needs to do to be okay with it? Because if you have audit and production not okay with it, then no matter what the developers do, it's still going to have to be thrown over a wall. And we're trying to break that wall down. Once you have those requirements, you have to look at what your budget is. As a development team, you generally don't have the kind of budget to go in and buy product from an IBM or a CA or even a Zabbia or a Harness, because they're going to charge you quite a bit of money because they're going to charge based on endpoints. So are you going to have to do it around open source, and does the current open source offering fit your needs? So start there. Start asking the question between dev and ops and really get a clear contract. I used to call it a compliance scorecard. What do you need to be, if you're a developer, what do you need to do to be compliant in order to be able to do production releases on a high frequency basis? And if you're production and you want that to happen, what do the developers need to give you in order for you to meet the audit compliance? So it's a discussion. That's the first place to start. And once you get that discussion done, you're way ahead of everybody else. And then fitting in the right tools becomes a lot easier.
All right, great. Just another reminder to the audience, if you have a question for Tracy, go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your question. We still have about 15 minutes or so. And on to the next question. Do you need deployment automation if you use GitHub Actions?
Yes. So think about that, the screen I put up about the full stack. So a GitHub action is going to be associated to one of your repositories, and it's going to exit out, and it's going to say, go do something. An action itself. So GitHub itself is a platform. It doesn't do automated testing. It doesn't do automated deployments. It doesn't do compiles. Just like Jenkins doesn't do any of those things. What it really does is it's a orchestration engine. So GitHub Actions, which I think are very exciting, and everybody yelled and screamed when they announced it at the GitHub Universe, was kind of fun. GitHub Actions are a way to build a continuous delivery workflow process for your repository within the GitHub platform. But you are going to need to exit out to have those actions call something that does the heavy lifting on your behalf for doing the deployments and for creating the continuous testing. So yes, GitHub Actions, even though they're out there and you can script all kinds of cool stuff and make them do things like update a Docker container, they're not really intended to manage large production environments, and they're not going to do the kind of continuous deployment that we talked about today.
Okay. All right, great. Let's see. Looks like we have one more question here. So last call for questions, folks. If you have one, go ahead and submit it now. Let's see. How is Deploy Hub different from Zabbia Labs or Harness.io?
So first of all, Deploy Hub is based on an open source project. Neither of the other two are. Zabbia doesn't have as much of the packaging functionality as Deploy Hub and Harness. So both Deploy Hub and Harness have what I would call a blueprint designer to define your application package and the components underneath it. With Zabbia, you do that outside of the product and you give it a zip file, and then it will manage that zip file, but there's a lot of intelligence in that zip file. I'd say the positive on Zabbia is it's really sexy. It's got some really nice reports. I would like to see our open source tool have a sexier dashboard for upper level management to really have better insight. Between Harness and Deploy Hub, they're pretty similar, but none of Harness or Zabbia, neither one of them have a backend versioning engine. Harness, so if you ask Zabbia or Harness if you can do a database update and do a database rollback, they're going to say no, because they don't have that back-end versioning engine to go, okay, I know that the differences between, I know how to roll back something or I know how to roll forward something, and I can do it between very different versions, like from version 3 to version 10. That you need to do that. You have to have that the version control engine in the back end that's doing the versioning, and all the configuration as code. All three of us are agentless. 2 of us are SaaS. Harness and Deploy Hub are both SaaS. So we're close. All 3 of us are very close. I think that they'll all change quite a bit over the course of going through microservices. I think that where the changes will be, though, will be in more the ability to better manage the packaging and to do more of the versioning, so that you have always a logical representation of what I keep calling that monolithic equivalent.
All right, Great. Well, that is all the questions that we have. So I do want to thank everybody who did submit a question to Tracy. Lots of wide-ranging questions there. So thanks very much, guys. I appreciate it. I also want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of the event, you will be able to access it on demand. Hopefully later on this afternoon, you'll be receiving an email that will contain a link to the webinar on demand. The webinar is also going to be on the DevOps.com website, so you can always find it there. Just go to webinars, the webinars page on DevOps.com on demand, and it should be right there waiting for you. And then while you're there at the site, take a look at some of the other webinars that we have both on demand and upcoming, and hopefully there'll be one or two that pique your interest. Tracy Reagan, thanks again for giving such a great presentation, as always.
Thank you. Have a great holiday season, and I hope to see you at KubeCon.
Yeah, and I do want to thank the audience also for joining me today. And this is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody.